In the winter of 1891, a man who had built an empire from frozen ground stood at the edge of his lumber yard and felt like a ghost in his own life. Elijah Cross owned the largest mill in Harlan County, Montana. 300 workers, contracts with the railroad, timber enough to build a city. Men said his name like it meant something. But every morning he woke to a house so quiet he could hear the walls settling, and some days that sound was the only proof he was still alive. He had been this way for 7 years, since the avalanche took Margaret on the Ridgeback Pass in February of 1884. Since he'd spent 3 days digging through snow with his bare hands and found nothing but her wool scarf, still folded the way she'd always folded it, like she'd just set it down a moment ago and would be back to pick it up. He stopped expecting her back somewhere, around year 2. But he never stopped listening for her footsteps in the hallway. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The snow had been falling since Tuesday. Elijah Cross stood on the porch of the mill office, a mug of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the men work through the gray morning. He was 51 years old. He moved like a younger man still, straight-backed and deliberate. But his foreman, Dade Morrow, said the boss had eyes like a man who'd seen everything twice, and hadn't been surprised by any of it. He heard the commotion near the gate before he saw what caused it. 2 of his workers, Jensen and the new kid, whose name he kept forgetting, were standing at the entrance arguing with someone on the other side of the fence. Elijah set down the coffee and walked over. The someone was a young woman. She was maybe 25, 26. Hard to tell under the circumstances. She wore a man's coat 3 sizes too large, her dark hair pushed under a felt hat with a broken brim. She was carrying a canvas bag and a look on her face that Elijah recognized immediately. Not desperation, exactly, but the deliberate calm of someone who had already survived the worst and was now simply dealing with whatever came next. She was trying to explain herself to Jensen, who wasn't listening. "We don't hire women," Jensen was saying. "Mill work's no place for." "I'm not asking for mill work," the woman said. Her voice was even. "Patient, the kind of patient that costs something. I heard you feed your workers. I can cook. I can clean. I can keep accounts if you need it. I'm asking for a chance to prove that, not for a favor." Jensen looked back at Elijah and shrugged, like the whole situation was mildly embarrassing for everyone involved. Elijah looked at the woman. She looked back at him. She didn't smile or soften herself. She just waited. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. She hesitated, just half a second, "East of here." "That's a big territory." "Yes, sir, it is." "You have people?" "No, sir." "References? Anyone who can speak to your work?" "No, sir." He studied her. The coat was too big but well maintained. Someone had stitched the left cuff twice, careful, small stitches, the kind you make when you intend to keep something for a long time. Her boots were cracked at the toe but resoled recently. This was a woman who took care of what she had. "What's your name?" "Clara Voss." He turned and walked back toward the office. After a moment, he called over his shoulder, "Tell Dade to show her the cookhouse." Jensen looked baffled. Clara Voss looked at no one in particular. Then she picked up her bag and followed. The cookhouse was a long, low building attached to the back of the main hall. It had a cast-iron range big enough to roast an ox, shelving that ran floor to ceiling, and enough dust and grease on the walls to suggest the last cook had left in a hurry, and nobody had properly replaced him. Dade Morrow, Elijah's foreman, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a gray beard and a voice like gravel, showed her the space without comment. Then he said, "Breakfast is at 5:30. 60 men, give or take. Lunch is noon, or whenever they drag themselves in. Supper at 6. Boss eats at the office, not with the crew." "I understand." "There's a room off the back. Small, single bunk. Used to be the storekeeper's before he moved to Billings." "That'll do fine." Dade nodded. Looked like he was going to leave, then stopped. "You walked here?"
Yes.
"From where?" "Far enough." He looked at her a moment longer than was polite, the way a man looks at something that doesn't quite add up. Then he put his hat back on. 5:30, he said, and left. Clara set her bag on the narrow bunk and sat down beside it. The ropes creaked. The room smelled like sawdust and old wool. Through the small window she could see the edge of the yard, where pine logs were stacked 30 feet high, and beyond them the dark line of the forest against the white sky. She had made it. That was the only thought she allowed herself. She had made it, and for now that was enough. And she had been walking for 11 days. Not continuously. She'd worked 3 days in a town called Millhaven, washing dishes at the saloon, until the owner started asking about where she'd come from and who she knew. She'd left before dawn on the 4th day, owing him nothing, taking nothing that wasn't hers. Before Millhaven was the train from Spokane, and before the train was a month hiding in plain sight in Spokane itself, and before Spokane was everything she didn't let herself think about anymore, because thinking about it required energy she needed for other things. Her father's name was Edmund Voss. He owned the largest bank in Cascade Falls, Oregon. He was respected, admired, the kind of man who gave money to the church at Christmas, and who everyone agreed was a pillar of the community. And if anyone heard things occasionally, raised voices from the Voss house, a girl who never smiled quite right, a daughter who seemed to choose her words like she was walking on ice. Well, men like Edmund Voss had bad days like anyone else. Clara had bad days too, for 23 years. She started cooking breakfast at 4:45 that first morning, before the light came up, and by 5:30 she had eggs, salt pork, biscuits, and coffee, strong enough to start an engine. The men came in stomping snow off their boots, and sat down without expecting much, and left, having eaten better than they had in months. Word got back to Elijah by mid-morning. He went to see for himself at supper. He stood in the doorway of the main hall and watched her work. She moved through the space with a particular economy of motion. No wasted steps, no wasted gestures. When one of the younger workers knocked a tin cup off the table, and she reached out and caught it before it hit the floor, nobody said anything, but a few of the men exchanged a look. He brought his meal to the office herself that evening, knocked twice, and set it on the desk when he told her to come in. He looked at the plate, beef stew, fresh bread, a small dish of preserved plums that he didn't know he had in the pantry. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" "My mother," she said, and years after that. He ate. She waited, straight-backed in the chair across from him, hands folded in her lap. "You're hiding from something," he said. "I'm not hiding. I'm working. You came 11 days on foot through a Montana winter. People don't do that unless something drove them." She looked at him steadily. People also don't walk 11 days unless they have a reason to arrive somewhere. He put down his fork. "What does that mean?" "It means I chose this direction, Mr. Cross. I'm not just running away. I'm running towards something." "What?" "A place where I can be useful without being punished for it." The office was quiet, except for the wind pushing at the window and the distant sound of the mill shutting down for the night. Elijah looked at this young woman, who had cooked for 60 men on her first day in a new town, with no supplies she'd had a chance to inventory, and who was now sitting across from him talking about usefulness, the way other people talked about oxygen. He thought about Margaret, not with the usual grief, but with something else, a kind of recognition. Margaret had been the same way, practical about her worth, clear-eyed about what she needed. "That's all?" he asked. "That's all," she said. He picked up his fork again. "Dinner's good," he said. That was as close to gratitude as Elijah Cross got in those years, and somehow she understood that. "Good night, Mr. Cross." "Good night, Miss Voss." The first 2 weeks moved like water finding level. Clara learned the rhythms of the mill, what time the early shift wanted breakfast, which men ate fast and needed refills, which ones lingered and needed the coffee kept hot. She reorganized the pantry in the second week, found flour that had been stored wrong and fixed it, discovered they were paying twice the going rate for salt because no one had checked a contract in 3 years. She brought the contract discrepancy to Dade, who brought it to Elijah, who called her to the office and stared at the paper for a long moment. "You found this in the pantry?" "Behind the lard tins. There was a file box. I wasn't prying, I was looking for the order records." Elijah set the paper down. "You said you could keep accounts." "I said I could, if you needed it." He slid a ledger across the desk. "There's 3 months of receivables in there that don't match the outgoing numbers. If you can find the discrepancy, there's a real wage in it for you, not room and board." She picked up the ledger, looked at it the way someone looks at a language they know but haven't spoken in a while. Then she nodded and took it with her. She found the discrepancy in 2 days. $1,400, siphoned slowly over 18 months by a supplier Elijah had trusted for years. The kind of theft that only worked because everyone assumed it wasn't happening. Elijah stared at her work for a long time. "How did you know where to look?" he asked. "I grew up watching my father's accounts," she said. "I know what money looks like when someone's trying not to see it." She said it without expression, But something in the phrasing sat with Elijah afterward, long after she'd gone back to the cookhouse. People who grew up watching accounts usually grew up watching something else alongside them. The third week brought a cold snap that pushed the temperature to 30 below. The mill slowed. 2 men got frostbite and had to be carried in from the far yard. Clara had hot water, clean cloth, and what she needed waiting before Dady had finished explaining the situation. She knew how to treat frostbite. She knew how to dress a wound. She knew which men were too proud to say they were in pain and needed to be told to sit down instead of asked. Elijah watched her from the doorway of the hall and said nothing. But Dade found him there and said quietly, "Where exactly did you find this woman?" "She found us," Elijah said. "Smart woman." "Yes." The day she went into Harlan to get supplies was the day things changed. Elijah drove her himself. He said it was because the roads were bad and she didn't know the town, which were both true and also beside the point. He helped her into the wagon and drove the 4 miles to town without saying much, which neither of them seemed to mind. At the general store, the owner, a round man named Colton, greeted Elijah with the particular deference reserved for men who spent significant money regularly. He greeted Clara with a look that traveled up and down her coat and settled somewhere around doubtful. She handed him the supply list. He read it slowly. "This is a substantial order," he said. "Can you fill it?" "For you, Mr. Cross, certainly." He looked at Clara. "She your new cook?" "She manages the cookhouse," Elijah said. Colton raised his eyebrows just slightly, the way men do when they want to comment on something, and decide it isn't worth the trouble. They collected the supplies in relative quiet. On the way back, Clara said, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" "Correct him. He keeps my business. He'll keep his opinions to himself or find someone else to keep his business." She looked out at the snow-covered road. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without the particular weight people sometimes put on gratitude when they're not used to receiving things. He asked her, the same way Caleb had asked Lydia, but in his own words, "What made you stop here, of all places?" She thought for a moment. "I saw smoke from the mill," she said. 3 nights before I arrived, I was camping in the tree line, trying to decide if I had the energy to keep going north. And I saw that smoke and I thought, someone's working. Somebody out there still believes the work is worth doing even when everything else is frozen solid." She paused. "I wanted to be around that, whatever it was." Elijah kept his eyes on the road. "I work at night sometimes," he said, "when I can't sleep, just to have something to do with my hands." "How long have you not been able to sleep?" 7 years. She didn't ask why, she just nodded. The way a person nods when they recognize a number that has a story behind it they won't ask you to tell. The trouble came on a Thursday. Clara was in the cookhouse when she heard the horse. It wasn't one of the mill horses. She knew their sounds by now, each one slightly different. This animal was tired. It had been ridden hard. She went to the window. The man dismounting in the yard was named Gerald Fitch. He was her father's lawyer. She had known him since she was 7 years old. He had a broad face, good boots, and the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told he couldn't go somewhere. She stayed very still. He went to the mill office. 20 minutes later, Dade came to find her. "There's a man in the office," he said. "Looking for a woman named Clara Voss. Says she's the daughter of Edmund Voss of Cascade Falls. Says her father is worried about her." "He says a lot of things," Clara said. Her voice was flat. Dade studied her. "You want to tell me what's actually going on?" She set down the bread dough she'd been working and turned to face him. "My father is a man people believe," she said. "He's believed when he says he's worried about me, and he'll be believed if he says I stole something, or that I'm ill, or that I'm not in my right mind. All of those are things he has said before when it suited him. None of them are true, but that hasn't mattered much." Dade was quiet for a moment. "What does he actually want?" "He wants me back in Cascade Falls, under his roof, under his control. He owns everyone in that town, Mr. Morrow, the judge, the sheriff, the minister. The only reason I'm still free is that I got far enough away fast enough." Dade looked at his hat in his hands. "Does the boss know?" "No." "He's going to need to." She nodded. "I know." Elijah had Gerald Fitch sitting across from his desk when Clara came in. She didn't knock. Fitch looked up and his expression went through several things quickly before settling on something that was trying to look concerned. "Clara," he said, "thank God, your father has been sick with worry." "My father doesn't worry about people," she said. "He worries about property." Fitch's expression adjusted. She's not well, he said to Elijah, as if Elijah were a third party to be persuaded. She left home in distress. Her father only wants to make sure she's safe. Elijah looked at Clara. She met his eyes, said nothing. He looked back at Fitch. She seems well to me. Mr. Cross, with respect, Edmund Voss is a significant figure in this region. A man of your standing would benefit from. I don't benefit from things, Elijah said. I earn them. He stood. You're welcome to rest your horse and get a meal before you head back to wherever you came from. But this woman is employed here, and she stays as long as she chooses to stay. Fitch stood too. He was the kind of man who recalibrated quickly. He looked at Clara one more time, a look that was meant to communicate that this wasn't finished, and then he picked up his hat and left. The office was very quiet. Are you all right? Elijah asked. She was gripping the back of the chair she'd walked up behind. She made herself let go. Yes, she said. Then no, I don't know. Sit down. She sat. Tell me, he said. So she told him. She didn't tell him everything. Not the worst of it, not the parts she'd spent 3 years learning to put somewhere she didn't have to look at. But she told him enough. About the accounts she'd managed that her father took credit for. About the man he'd tried to marry her to when she was 19. Because the man owed her father money, and this was how debts got cleared. About the year she'd spent with almost no freedom to leave the house because her father had decided her presence in society reflected on him, and her behavior had been, in his words, embarrassing. She told him about the night 8 months ago, when she'd finally understood that waiting for something to change was the same as choosing for nothing to change. Elijah listened. He didn't move. He didn't try to fill the silences. When she finished, he said, he'll send someone else. I know. Fitch will report back. Voss will try another approach. I know. Then we need to figure out what that approach is before it arrives. He leaned forward. You said he owns the judge and the sheriff in Cascade Falls. Does he have reach here? His bank holds paper on 2 operations in Harlan County. I don't know which ones. He nodded slowly. I do. She looked at him. One of them is yours? No, but one of them is a man I know well enough to call in a favor. Why would you do that? He paused, thought about it the way he did most things, carefully and without hurry. Because you walked 11 days in a Montana winter to get here, he said. Because you found $1,400 that nobody else bothered to look for. Because you've been in this valley for 3 weeks and already the men work harder and eat better and argue less. And I'm not sure anyone's explained that to you yet. He stood. Because when my wife died, I had people around me who made sure I didn't disappear entirely. You don't have people. You have me and Dade and 60 rough men who've already decided you're worth keeping around. That's something. And she looked at him for a long moment. You don't owe me anything, she said. I'm aware. He walked her back to the cookhouse through the snow. At the door, he said, Lock this tonight. I'll have Jensen keep an eye on the gate. She nodded. Elijah. Please? He turned. Thank you, she said it the same way she'd said it in the wagon. Simple real. He walked back to the office without answering, but he sat at his desk for a long time that night, the ledgers unopened in front of him, thinking about someone who said thank you like they'd learned not to expect anything to be thankful for. The second man Edmund Voss sent was not a lawyer. He arrived 10 days later, introduced himself as a federal marshal, and produced paperwork that claimed Clara Voss had left Cascade Falls with funds belonging to her father. The amount listed was $3,000. Clara had left Cascade Falls with $47 she had saved over 4 years from the household accounts she managed without being paid. Every penny of it was hers. Elijah read the paperwork. Then he handed it to Dade, who read it, then handed it to his brother-in-law Thomas, who happened to be a land attorney, and happened to have arrived from Billings the day before, which was not a coincidence. Thomas read it, looked up. This is a civil claim, not criminal, he said. He has no jurisdiction here. The marshal's commission is real, but the paperwork is being used wrong. This would need to go through the county court, and even then, we file a counterclaim, Elijah said. Thomas looked at Clara. On what grounds? On the grounds that Edmund Voss owes his daughter 7 years of wages for work performed without compensation, Clara said quietly. I have the records. I kept copies of everything. She reached into her coat and took out a folded oilskin packet. Thomas took it, opened it, and spent 4 minutes reading in silence. Then he said, Where did you learn to document like this? My father taught me to keep accounts, Clara said. He just didn't think I'd keep accounts of him. The false marshal left the property that afternoon. Thomas began drafting documents that evening. Clara cooked supper for 61 men, including Thomas, who ate 2 servings and asked for the recipe for the cornbread. That night, Elijah came to the cookhouse. He knocked, which was new. She opened the door. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee. She stepped aside and let him in. They sat at the small table. The stove ticked in the corner. Outside, the wind had dropped and the night was very still. He said, "You could have told me about the documents earlier." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "I needed to know I could trust you first." "Fair. And I needed to know you weren't helping me out of pity. I've had enough help that was really just control with better manners." He looked at her over the rim of his mug. He understood that distinction. He'd offered exactly that kind of help to people after Margaret died, showing up with food, with money, with arrangements, and called it care when it was really just his inability to tolerate things being wrong. "Not pity," he said. "I know." She looked at the mug. "That's why I told you about the documents." They sat in quiet for a while, the comfortable kind where neither person feels obligated to fill it. He told her about Margaret, eventually. Not that night, but a few nights later, when the snow had eased and Clara had started leaving the office door open when she brought his supper, and sometimes he forgot to eat it while it was hot because they were talking. He told her about the avalanche, about the 3 days with his hands in the snow, about the scarf. "I still have it," he said, "the scarf, in the top drawer of the dresser. I haven't touched it in 4 years, but I haven't moved it either." She nodded. "Did you have people around you after?" "Some. Dade stayed. The crew worked through it because they didn't know what else to do, and I think they knew that's what I needed. But mostly I just worked." "That's what you do when the grief is too big for anything else," she said. "You find the smallest useful thing, and you do it. And then the next day you find another one." He looked at her. "Yeah, that's it exactly." She was 27 years old. She'd spent most of those years being told what she could not do, could not say, could not be. But she knew grief. Her mother had died when Clara was 15, and she had watched her father treat that loss as an inconvenience to be managed. And she had learned that some people never find the smallest useful thing. Some people just find the nearest person to blame. It occurred to her that Elijah Cross had never once looked for someone to blame. That felt significant. The hearing was scheduled for March, when the passes cleared enough for travel. Thomas represented Clara. Edmund Voss arrived in Harlan County in person, which surprised everyone, and which Thomas said was actually a good sign. It meant Edmund wasn't as confident as he was pretending to be. Edmund Voss was 60 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed for a town that had not seen impeccable dress since the governor passed through in 1887. He sat in the county courtroom and radiated the patient certainty of a man who had never lost anything he'd decided to keep. Clara sat on the other side of the room and looked at him steadily. He didn't look at her. Not once during the proceeding. That told her more than anything he said. Thomas presented the records. 7 years of accounts, meticulous and dated. Wages calculated at standard household rates for a woman in her position. The number was significantly larger than $3,000. Clara's work was documented. Edmund's use of it was documented. The $47 Clara had taken was documented as money she had earned, and then some. Edmund's lawyer argued that a daughter's work within the family home was not compensable labor. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Harriet Crane, who had been on the bench for 12 years, let him finish. Then she said quietly, "This court has heard a great deal today about what this young woman owes her father. It has heard very little about what he owes her. Let me rectify that." The decision took 20 minutes. Outside the courthouse, Edmund Voss finally looked at Clara. He looked at her for a long time. She waited for something, anger, contempt, some last attempt at authority. Instead, he said, "Your mother would have done the same thing." He walked to his carriage and drove away, and Clara stood on the steps of the courthouse in the cold March air and felt something leave her. Not pain exactly, more like the particular weight of something you've been carrying, so long you stop noticing it until the moment it's gone. Elijah was standing behind her. She turned. He wasn't a man who showed things easily on his face, but his hands, she'd learned, told the truth, and they were relaxed in a way they almost never were. "It's done," he said. "Yes." "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I can breathe correctly for the first time in 8 months." He nodded. He didn't say anything about going back to the mill, didn't say anything about the road conditions or the time of day. He just stood there with her while the town of Harlan went about its business around them. Finally, she said, "What happens now?" He said, "That depends." On what? On whether you want to go back to the cookhouse, or whether you want me to take you somewhere else. He said it carefully. Some other town, some other position. You're free now, Clara. That's what this was for. She looked at him. Are you asking me to leave? No. Are you asking me to stay? He met her eyes. The wind picked up briefly, scattering snow from the eaves above them. Yes, he said. She said, why? Because the mill runs better with you in it. Because Dade's brother-in-law has asked 3 times if you're spoken for. Because I eat supper and remember it's hot for the first time in 7 years. He stopped, looked at his hands briefly, which was something he did when he was about to say something that cost him effort. And because when I come into the office in the morning and I see your handwriting in the ledger, he said slowly, I feel like something real is happening. Like I'm part of the world again, instead of just moving through it. She was quiet for a moment. I grew up being told I was too much, she said. Too organized, too certain, too unwilling to be managed. I've spent 8 months trying to figure out if that was true. Is it? She almost smiled. Yes, but apparently some people consider it an asset. He was still for a moment. Then I do. She said, I want to stay. I want to go back to the mill and keep the accounts properly, and plant something in that frozen yard come spring and see if anything grows. Elijah looked at her. Just that? She held his gaze. No, not just that. He reached out then, slowly the way a person moves, when they're not sure of their welcome but have decided to try anyway, and offered her his hand. She took it. They rode back to the mill, through the March cold. The passes were starting to clear. The sky was the particular pale blue that meant the worst of winter was turning. Somewhere ahead of them, the mill smoke rose straight up in the windless air, and the yard rang with the sound of work resuming. Dade met them at the gate. He looked at their faces and at their hands, and then he looked somewhere else and said, Supper's going to be late if nobody starts it. Clara let go of Elijah's hand and walked toward the cookhouse. At the door, she turned back. Elijah was still watching her. She went inside and started the stove. What followed was the kind of season that people look back on later and understand. Only from a distance was the moment when everything changed, not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly, the way the frost leaves the ground. You don't see it happening, but one morning the soil gives under your boot in a way it didn't the day before. Clara Voss moved out of the small room off the cookhouse and into the house proper that spring, not because anyone insisted and not because anything had been formally agreed to, but because Elijah had finished repairs on the east wing he'd been putting off for 6 years, and when she asked why he'd finally gotten around to it, he said only that it seemed like time. She kept the accounts and cooked when she wanted to, and taught 2 of the younger workers to read in the evenings. She planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house. She found Margaret's recipe book in the pantry, and set it on the shelf where it could be seen. She asked Elijah about it one evening. He said, I didn't put it there. She said, I know, I did. He was quiet for a moment. Is that all right? She nodded. She loved this place before I did. She should be part of it. He looked at the recipe book for a long time. Then he said, she would have liked you. Clara said, tell me about her. So he did. That night and other nights, until the shape of Margaret Cross lived in the house alongside them, not as a ghost, but as a presence, something that had been and mattered, and did not have to be erased for there to be room for what was becoming. They married in October. A small thing, just Dade and Thomas and the crew, and 2 neighbors from the valley, who had appeared at the house for supper over the summer, often enough to qualify as friends. The justice of the peace came from Harlan. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric she'd chosen at Colton's store. And Colton, who had watched the situation develop over the course of a year, gave her a discount without being asked and called her Miss Voss, with something that had stopped being doubt and become something closer to respect. Dodd cried. He was large enough and weathered enough that no one mentioned it. The mill ran better than it had in a decade. Thomas helped them restructure the supplier contracts, and the $1,400 they recovered became the seed of a secondary operation, a smaller yard that Clara managed directly, with her own books and her own crew. The first year it turned a modest profit. The second year it turned a real one. In November of 1894, Clara told Elijah she was expecting. He sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not quite joy, not quite fear, something that was both of those at once and larger than either. We'll need the doctor from Billings, he said. I know. I'll send Day this week. I know. He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned it over and held his in return. I was afraid this would never happen again, he said. For me. I know, she said. Me too. Their son was born in July, healthy and loud. They named him James, after nobody in particular, except that it was a name that sounded like it could carry weight and still feel comfortable. The crew responded the way men who work with their hands respond to the arrival of a baby, with complete practical devotion. Pike, who had been at the mill the longest and said almost nothing under normal circumstances, carved a cradle from black walnut and set it on the porch without a word of explanation. Elijah held his son and stood at the window, where he had stood for 7 years watching the yard and feeling like a dead man, and what he felt now was so different from that, and so close to it in shape, that it took him a moment to understand it was the opposite. Clara watched him from the doorway. He said without turning she would have loved him. Yes, Clara said, she would have. They stood like that, while James slept between them, and the mill ran in the valley below, and the summer light lasted long past supper time the way it does in Montana, like the world can't quite bring itself to end the day. The years that followed were not without difficulty, winters that killed cattle and closed passes for weeks at a time, a fire in the secondary yard that took 3 weeks to rebuild, a dispute with a neighboring operation that went to arbitration and cost them money and months of lost sleep. These things happened. But they happened to two people who had learned, separately and then together, that the worst thing is not the difficulty. The worst thing is the difficulty faced alone. Edmund Voss died in 1899. Clara received word by telegraph. She sat with the paper for a long time. Elijah didn't ask her what she was feeling. He made coffee and sat across from her and waited. She said eventually, I keep trying to feel more than I do. He was my father. Elijah said, he was what he was. You don't owe him grief either. She looked at the telegram. I hope there was someone there with him, even him. That's who you are, Elijah said. She folded the telegram and put it away and did not take it out again. James grew into a boy who liked numbers and horses equally, which meant he had gotten things from both of them. He learned the accounts at 12 and was better at them than Clara expected, which she told him, and which she could see pleased him more than he wanted to show. He had Elijah's stillness and her determination, and when he was 14 Dade said, straight-faced, that the boy was going to be a problem someday, meaning it as the highest praise. Elijah was 59 when his knee gave out from an old injury nobody had known about, and Clara spent 3 months managing both operations while he argued with the doctor, and then gradually accepted that some things changed whether you wanted them to or not. He adapted. That was who he was, someone who found the smallest useful thing and did it, and then the next one. Clara was 50 when she realized she had lived in the Harlan Valley for 25 years. She stood in the kitchen garden one morning, which had expanded considerably since its first modest season, and looked out at the mill and the yard and the mountains beyond, and she felt something she did not have a precise word for. Not happiness exactly, though it was that. Something larger, something that had to do with time. She had walked into this valley with $47 and a broken-brimmed hat, and a terror she'd gotten so accustomed to, she'd almost stopped calling it terror, and she had built something here. Not alone, never alone, that was the lesson she'd had to learn. That building alone wasn't strength, it was just stubbornness. But from her own choices, her own work, her own willingness to stop running and trust that something might hold, Dade found her standing there. He was 67, mostly retired, still present in the way that people who have been somewhere long enough become part of the place itself. He said, you're thinking loud. She smiled. How can you tell? You get a look, same look the boss gets. She looked back at the mountains. Do you think it was right? Stopping here? Ada was quiet for a moment. I think stopping anywhere takes courage, he said. Most people keep moving because moving feels like doing something. He paused. You stopped, and then you made it worth stopping for. She thought about that for a long time after he left. Worth stopping for. Yes, that was it. The garden grew. The accounts balanced. James married a woman from the valley who had opinions about everything, and a laugh that carried across the yard, and Clara liked her immediately. The mill passed to James, and then to his son, and the name on the door changed. But the books stayed in the same handwriting for years, because Clara kept them until she couldn't, and then she taught her granddaughter, and her granddaughter learned. Elijah died on a winter morning in 1912, in the same house he had built with his hands when he was young, and believed the work was enough. He died with Clara beside him, and James in the hall, and the mill running below in the valley as it had run every morning for 40 years. His last words were her name. She buried him next to Margaret, on the high ground behind the mill, where you could see everything. It felt right to her, not as erasure but as continuation. These were people who had loved this place and each other, and the long, difficult, beautiful work of being alive. There was room for all of them. Clara Voss Cross lived to be 81 years old. She saw James's children grown and settled. She saw the mill expanded twice, and the secondary yard become its own operation with its own name. She saw Harlan County change into something that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who'd arrived by foot through the snow in 1891, and she understood that this was right and good, that the world should change. She kept the garden until she couldn't. She kept the accounts until her hands gave out. She kept telling the story of the man who worked at night because he couldn't sleep, and the smoke she'd seen from 3 miles out, and the decision she'd made standing in the tree line in the Montana cold, toward, not away from something, toward. She died in a spring that smelled like the thaw coming early, which she would have appreciated. They buried her where she'd asked, next to Elijah on the high ground with the mill visible below. Her headstone read, Clara Voss Cross, 1866-1947. She stopped running and built something that lasted. For generations, the family told the story. About the woman who arrived with $47 and no references, and the particular calm of someone who had survived the worst already. About the man who had been going through the motions until the morning someone showed up at his gate and changed the motions into something real. About a garden planted in frozen ground that grew anyway. They told it because it was true, and because true stories matter, and because somewhere in every generation there's someone standing at the edge of something, trying to decide whether to keep moving or to stop. And sometimes what they need is just to know that stopping can be the bravest choice of all. I think about Clara a lot. Not the version of her at the end, the woman with the garden and the grandchildren and the headstone that said what it needed to say. I think about the version of her standing in a tree line in 30 below Montana cold, watching smoke rise from a mill she'd never been to, trying to decide if stopping was safe. That moment right there is where everything either happens or it doesn't. And what strikes me is that she didn't stop because she was certain. She stopped because she was done letting fear make the decision for her. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. What Clara had, and what I think people underestimate in her, was a particular kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. She didn't walk into Elijah's mill asking to be saved. She walked in offering something real, her work, her skill, the accounts she'd kept for years that nobody had bothered to look at twice. She had every reason to be bitter, to be small, to take whatever she could and keep moving. Instead, she documented everything. She kept copies. She stayed honest even when honesty had gotten her nothing for 23 years. That's character. That's the kind of moral backbone that doesn't come from rules. It comes from deciding, quietly, who you're going to be regardless of what the world does back. And then there's what she knew. Clara was sharper than anyone in that story gave her credit for, and she knew it, and she used it without apology. She found $1,400 in a ledger inside 2 days. She understood that her father's power depended on people not looking closely enough. She looked. That's what intelligence actually is, in my experience. Not being the smartest person in the room, but being the one willing to look at what everyone else has decided isn't worth examining. Clara looked at the world with clear eyes and kept records, and that ultimately is what set her free. Not luck, not rescue, documentation. But the part that gets me most is the walking. 11 days through Montana in winter, $47 and a broken-brimmed hat. She didn't know Elijah Cross existed. She didn't know there would be a cookhouse or a room off the back or a foreman named Dade who would eventually cry at her wedding. She just saw smoke and walked toward it. That kind of persistence, the kind that keeps moving, not because it knows where it's going, but because stopping feels like surrender. That's what I think people mean when they talk about grit. Not toughness, not the absence of fear. The decision to keep walking even when the fear is real and the destination is uncertain. What I take from Clara and Elijah both is that broken people don't have to fix themselves before they're allowed to build something. They built it while they were still figuring out how to carry what they'd lost. The mill, the accounts, the garden, the boy named James, all of it grew alongside the grief, not after it was gone. That's the version of hope I believe in. Not the kind that waits for the hard part to be over. The kind that plants seeds in frozen ground and comes back in the spring to see what held.